Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from ODESZA, The Last Goodbye. Oh boy, ODESZA, the American duo of Clayton Knight and Harrison Mills, who I keep thinking are Australian, but they're not. One of the most mega popular acts working in electronic music right now. They command a presence on this scene like few others can. They, alongside Lindsey Sterling, are kind of the default acts for the iTunes electronic charts top spots. Anytime they release an album, you can bet it's going to be at the top of that chart, or at least somewhere around that level until the end of time. And anytime another act comes to challenge them, they'll be unseated for a week and then just take back their spot afterwards. I'll admit that I myself have never really had especially strong feelings on ODESZA one way or the other. I can definitely see why their typical style of super over-the-top and epic EDM indie pop arrangements with varied world music instrumentation and pitch-shifted samples would really resonate with people on such a deep level. All their stuff is designed to tug at everyone's heartstrings as hard as reasonably possible and is trying to sound as big and impressive as it can. With that said, I also feel like their style is very commercial and mainstream friendly, designed to appeal to as wide an audience as possible without offending anyone. They're the kind of band that make music that you'd frequently hear through soundtracks for advertisements and lean on a lot of millennial pop cliches, perhaps even having helped set some of said cliches into motion. And while they don't have any music I flat out dislike, they don't really have anything I personally hold really close to my heart either. They're one of the first bands I think of when I think of that indie-influenced EDM sound, which isn't indie at all, that really broke out in the mid-later 2010s. They're an act that I primarily associate with that one specific moment in time. My favorite album of theirs is their debut, Summer's Gone. That album always felt like it served more of a chill kind of audience, influenced by artists like Bonobo, Pretty Lights, or Tycho, and executing its dramatic and nostalgic ambience particularly well. And while their other two albums are cool and have their moments, they haven't stuck with me quite as much. In Return had two tracks I really liked in Say My Name and It's Only, the former of which I think is still their most successful single to this day, and is probably still my favorite track they've ever done to this day. But the rest of the album, despite having plenty of well-textured instrumentation, still oddly came off a little too generic in its compositions to really connect with me, and much of it kind of ran together. And A Moment Apart, which I actually reviewed back when it came out in 2017, was much more of a mixed bag, with some moments that reached much more impressive and memorable heights than anything else in their catalog, and others that feel really dated to that specific time, either coming off forgettable or even mildly annoying me in a few cases. Not to mention, with nearly every track trying to feel like a big epic single, over the course of 15 tracks, it got a bit overbearing, and lacked enough subtlety to balance things out and contrast with all the heavy moments to make them hit with as much impact as they could. The video I did on A Moment Apart still stands among my most controversial and widely disliked reviews. Perhaps not to the same level as, say, my Flume review, since I actively dislike that guy's music, but I do know a lot of people feel really strongly about ODESZA and have made it abundantly clear how strongly they disagree with my mostly lukewarm takes on them. Hey, if you do find their music to be so life-changingly amazing, that's great. I do get the appeal, but I'm just here to outline my own experience, and I personally just think they're alright. With all that background, I knew I had to cover this latest album just for the sake of my own bottom line. I figured I'd generally be okay with it, but probably wouldn't be so enamored with it where it'd be a keeper. I mean, that title seems to imply some kind of swansong for the duo, although I strongly suspect they won't actually be going anywhere after this. Worst case scenario, this ends up like Röyksopp's The Inevitable End, and they take a hiatus and come back a few years later. And to be honest, I think it's just kind of a normal album cycle for them, with the title not meaning anything special and just trying to fit with the typical dramatic and emotional tone of their music. I was absolutely not going in expecting anything life-changing. I was pretty much just listening for the easy opportunity for some ad revenue and not out of any personal investment in what they're doing. And while The Last Goodbye is in fact nothing life-changing, I have been sitting with it for a couple of days and I've been like, you know what? I'm getting into this a fair bit more than I thought I would. I mean, sonically, it's in the exact same territory that you would expect. Very much an ODESZA album through and through that retains all the same typical epic and sweeping style, with the same tendencies towards more commercially viable sounds. maybe replacing the harsher vocal pitching of their earlier work with maybe a few touches of the recent strain of house revivalism that's been popular lately to make sure they don't sound stuck in 2017. There's really nothing in terms of, like, big surprises for me, just aside from the amount of personal enjoyment I happen to get out of it. It's much more consistent than A Moment Apart. I'd even go as far to say there's no outright clunkers in the bunch, but it isn't as lacking in major high points as In Return was for me either. There were actually a decent handful of tracks that stood out to me more. Again, I'm not going to say it's like absolutely incredible or anything, but all of it was at least pretty good, and honestly I was pleasantly surprised by the whole experience. Going through individual tracks, the album starts out in exactly the way you'd expect, with the intro, This Version of You, a typically sentimental blend of pianos and strings and spoken word from Juliana Barwick, and what sounds like recordings of the guys from ODESZA playing with their kids, like, placed way in the background. Those pop up quite a bit throughout the album. Yeah, this intro, it's nice, even if very predictable. But then we get the real opener in Wide Awake with Charlie Houston, which is also very predictable. Houston is your standard generic indie vocal feature. She sounds the same as pretty much all the other female guest vocalists who've shown up on ODESZA tracks, and there's a chopped up vocal sample from some old soul or R&B cut acting as a chorus. All of it goes over a pretty standard and inoffensive house instrumental with a bouncy set of synth chords. Absolutely nothing I haven't heard a million times before, but it still has a really solid tune, and it is all around well executed for what it is. It did pull me in pretty effectively right from the get-go, I will say that. Next we get Love Letter, a collaboration with new disco outfit The Knox, which did admittedly throw me off on first listen thanks to that scratchy-voiced lead vocal sample being used as the hook. Sounded kinda off-key and unappealing to me at first, but the more I listened to the track, the more it grew on me and the less bothered I was by the sample, which at least has a fittingly impassioned delivery, and the mix of dramatic piano playings with wobbling synth leads and a banging drop pulled me in quite nicely as well. It's good. Behind the Sun is your standard epic ODESZA instrumental with the world music influences. Got a sample of some ethnic singing that maybe sounds vaguely Indian, going over giant watches of strings, slow plodding beats, and some heavily percussive drops made out of what sounds like a college drum line or something. This track is another major grower. While it sounds like a number of other tracks they've come up with over the years, its sense of cinematic epicness is never, like, undercut by any generic pop elements, and it provides all its various instrumentation with plenty of space to breathe, while remaining very full-sounding. Actually pretty impressive. Forgive Me was another track I was primed to dislike at first, especially off the promise of the first minute or so of the track, which I'm still not crazy about. Containing a cheery-sounding C major chord progression, light guitars, Kaigoish tropical house flares, the generic indie girl voice of Izzy Bizu, or however you say that, sorry. Also the generic-ass lyrics about forgiveness or whatever. Not that any of the lyrics matter, especially when it comes to a project like this, but it all just sounded ready-made to soundtrack a beer commercial that takes place next to a beach or something, and I was just not having it. That is, until the second the chorus kicks in, when the track shifts into something completely different. It switches into like this stomping new disco cut, complete with a retro string section to give it a little bit of like that old 70s flair, and turning what would have otherwise been the clear least favorite in the bunch into one of the bigger highlights. I also like how they kinda like sidechain the string sections to make them sound like the typical big sidechaining synth chords they use all the time in like the In Return era. So that's a nice touch too. There's a pretty solid instrumental in North Garden, based around some old samples that sound somewhere between like a gospel choir or like a high-pitched 60s bubblegum pop group, turned into something pretty warm and heartfelt. I go back and forth with how much I like that sample, but it's well done enough for me to mark as a favorite. Then we get the next vocal track, Better Now, this time featuring the slightly deeper voiced generic indie singer Marot. Once again, did not care for this track much at all the first time I heard it. Thought the production on this one leaned more on like a trendier mainstream sound than anything else on the album. Maybe even a tiny bit trap-flavored with its stormy bass and screechy major key synth leads. Sounds like Tate McRae's You Broke Me First a little bit. But once again, the more I heard it, the more the core tune grew on me and I stopped being bothered by it. Honestly, packs a decent punch for what it's going for, even if it's not like a major favorite. But all of that pales in comparison to the album's title track and lead single, clearly the big centerpiece which the entire project is built around and feels markedly larger scale than pretty much anything that came before. A longer track nearly reaching 6 minutes, but containing quite a bit more progression from all these fluttering, blocky synth chord progressions that kind of have like a rival consoles-esque texture to them, to the soul-flecked house most of the track goes for, driven by a sample of Betty LaVette's Let Me Down Easy, even properly crediting LaVette as a feature despite taking from a recording from the 60s. And there's also that cool part in the middle with like the funk bass lines that vaguely resemble like Deadmau5's Sia. It all works together really damn well and remains exciting and emotionally investing the whole time. Honestly, kinda floored me. I was not at all anticipating another track of theirs to land in properly great territory for me. I don't think that's really happened since Say My Name. Perhaps unfortunately, the album does hit a bit of a lull from this point onwards, and there's just 4 tracks in a row which don't really do much for me. All My Life sounds like a return to the sounds of In Return with its saccharine mix of harps and shuffling beats and soul samples, which honestly don't sound quite as good as most of the other soul samples on here. And I guess the family recording of one of their kids learning to walk or something like that is kinda cute, but I got sick of hearing the more I listened to it. I felt like Maze Hughes from Fullmetal Alchemist was like shoving his family pictures in my face after a while. Equal with Lapsley is another okay enough vocal track with some solid blaring synth bass and energetic beats, but just blends into the background for me. Healing Grid sounds kind of like a weaker and less memorable companion to North Garden with lively orchestral samples as a backdrop alongside this kind of annoying sample of a guy humming to himself as the hook. I Can't Sleep features a switch into a 6/8 time signature, which is nice, but isn't really that notable outside of that. Pretty much all of these could be skips for me, fine enough while they're on, but I consistently find myself losing interest in tuning out during pretty much this entire stretch. But that leaves the closer, Light of Day, featuring Olafur Arnalds, which, oh wow, I was not prepared for this one at all. This track not only easily makes up for my middling feelings on the previous 4 tracks, and is not only the best track on the album above even the title track, I think this might be my new favorite ODESZA track overall. Arnold's presence on the track turned out to go further than just simply playing some heartfelt piano at the beginning. Perhaps directly thanks to his input, the entire cut gives me the same kind of vibes as something that would show up on Erased Tapes records. The shuffling but low-key beats and all the fluttering trained synth chords, which once again have that slight rival consoles-ish texture to them, all being given the epic ODESZA treatment through their big orchestral string sections and melancholy 60s soul sample. It all works together fantastically. I liked the track when I first heard it, but 5 or so listens later, it's gotten to resonate strongly enough with me that it can legit get me to tear up a little bit. It has me like, damn, is this what it's like to actually be a fan of these guys? Absolutely fantastic finish to the album that frankly blows everything else here out of the water. This track by itself could theoretically rank among my favorite, individual tracks of 2022. Now, as a complete whole, this album is definitely not going to be a year-end list contender. Honestly, don't see myself keeping the project in its full, unbroken entirety. There's a bit too many tracks that kind of fell into the standard commercial formulas that ODESZA tend to stick to, and that whole mess stretch near the end makes it kind of a hard one to completely sign off on as being something truly special in the big scheme of things. But I went in expecting the whole album to be like that mess stretch near the end, and ended up with a decent handful of tracks I liked and even 2 that I loved. Not to mention, one more thing that gave this album a little bit of an extra push in my mind was realizing its parallels with another album that came out this year. And sorry for this so closely echoing the A Moment Apart review, but just like when I reviewed that album and made a lot of parallels between it and Bonobo's Migration, I saw a lot of parallels in The Last Goodbye to Bonobo's latest album Fragments as well. Same sort of stylistic shift being made here towards the recent trend of deep house revivalism, and heck, the track Otoma would seamlessly fit on the track listing of this album, even if it wouldn't stand out nearly as much in this context as most tracks here sound kinda like that one. And I feel like I can make the direct parallel since ODESZA have always struck me as being very heavily inspired by Bonobo since the very beginning, even if they serve a much different kind of audience. But I can't believe I'm saying this. I think The Last Goodbye is a little better than Fragments. Part of that is absolutely an expectations thing. I went into Fragments with higher expectations since Bonobo is a consistent downtempo producer I've been a fan of for years, and I came out comparatively underwhelmed with that album. And I went into The Last Goodbye with lower expectations since ODESZA are a much less consistent big EDM festival act that I'm not nearly as big a fan of, but I came out pleasantly surprised by. Personal enjoyment wise, the two albums are admittedly like right on par with each other, and I was honestly gonna give them the same score for a while. But the more I sat with this one, the more it set itself apart as the stronger of the two. The fuller sound ODESZA usually explore is a better fit for the recent house revivalism trend than Bonobo's typically much more laid-back sound. They incorporated this house trend into their sound in such a way where you could theoretically not even notice anything had changed at all, where Bonobo sounded like he was making more of a concession at the times. But even on top of that, even if both albums are like a slight mixed bag, mostly ranging from pretty solid to alright, nothing on Fragments reaches the same heights for me as Light of Day or the title track on this album, or even comes particularly close, to be honest. So, I guess take that all as you will. The Last Goodbye is not a masterpiece by any stretch, but I did enjoy it a lot more than I thought I was going to. Enough to just let it get away with a 7.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.